Hello, hello, all you cool cats and kittens. Um, Great Gatsby, Chapter 5. Wow, there's a lot going on in this chapter. In all of literature, this is one of my favorite chapters. There is so much going on in terms of imagery, in terms of metaphor, playing with mythology, right? There, it is so rich. It's like the best cheesecake you've ever had, and you know, you can take out just a little bit and it's completely satisfying, but there's just this whole thing left, right? So let's get into it. Like I said in the very first video, I'm not going to be able to get to everything in these videos. Um, so with this one, what I want to focus on is really exposing a few different things. Um, exposing the idea of the weaving of these classics into um, this novel about the American dream, right? There are a couple different huge, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Essential touchstones of human culture that are being woven throughout this novel. One of them is God and the idea of God, whether it be religious or not religious, whether it be Christian God or any other, um, but Gatsby as God or a God figure is one thing we're going to talk about. Another one is um, Greek mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, and how Daisy kind of represents some elements of that. And then finally, like we touched on with the previous video, um, the Shakespearean tragedy of all of this, right? We think of Romeo and Juliet, the greatest romance ever written, is also played with in this chapter and in this novel. Let's start. Let's go through the chapter kind of chronologically, and then about towards the middle, it'll branch off into those areas. So, in the beginning, right, Caraway comes home, and Gatsby's got the house all lit up, right, ready to go. He shows up, and there's some manipulation being attempted by Gatsby in the beginning, right? Let's go for a ride. Let's go to Coney Island. Let's do this. Hey, I've got this job opportunity. What's unclear is why Gatsby is doing that. Is he simply trying to manipulate Nick so that Nick feels indebted to Gatsby, right? Gatsby's trying to make him a member of his crew, essentially, right? One of his underbosses or something like that. Or is he trying to legitimately make a human connection with somebody? Gatsby doesn't seem to have a lot of friends. If we think back to the previous chapter with him and Wolfsheim, there's like no, besides their mutual admiration and their business connection, there's no real human connection between them. You think of Clipsinger, who's living in Gatsby's house, there's no real connection there either. So is this Gatsby's attempt to make a human connection, or is he just trying to acquire Caraway as he has acquired so many other things? And it's unclear until the end of the chapter when Gatsby has gotten what he wants out of Caraway and kind of discards him, right? He still wants him to come along to the house, still wants him to do all these things with them. But the question is, does he want him around because he really thinks of Caraway as a friend, or simply because he wants somebody to witness his greatness, right? That's ultimately the question. When Gatsby is first described the day of the meeting between he and Daisy, he is dressed in silver and gold, clearly an allusion to his immense wealth, right? Interesting thing that happens. Time. Okay. And this goes into the romance, right? When we describe moments of, high romance, right? It's like time stood still, right? Everything stopped, right? In movies and literature and whatever, right? Everything stops and it's all about that moment. Well, that happens here too, right? Gatsby and Daisy haven't seen each other in 5 years and time stops. And Fitzgerald goes out of his way to really emphasize this point, right? He says, for half a minute, there wasn't a sound. Later, a pause. It endured horribly. There's the defunct clock that Gatsby knocks off the wall. Um, Caraway says, I think we all believed for a moment that it, meaning the clock, had smashed on the floor, right? Later, Caraway says it set us all back at least another minute. So time stops. There are all these references to time or things having to do with time. What's interesting is that when we romanticize a moment and we talk about time stopping, it's the swelling of emotions. And here, it's completely devoid of emotion except for discomfort. We feel uncomfortable. We feel Gatsby's discomfort. We feel Caraway's discomfort. We feel Daisy's discomfort. And we feel our own discomfort because here we just got the story about how these two star-crossed lovers separated by literally an ocean separated them. He came back, he gained all this wealth, he bought the house across the sound from her, right? And here he is, and finally they're back together, and we're expecting this grand, beautiful, deeply romantic moment. And it's not. It's the complete opposite. It's awkward and it is painful. It is painful to read those 3 to 4 pages, right? And Gatsby even says at one point, "Oh God, what am I doing? This is awful." And Caraway has to treat him like a little kid. You get in there. She's all by herself. What are you doing? And finally, Gatsby, like, okay, okay, okay. What's also striking in this moment is the lack of color description. Right. The last color description we really get before the meeting is Daisy showing up with the lavender. She's got her lavender hat on, and the hair on her face makes it look like there's a blue streak on her face. And that is it in terms of color. Gatsby shows, he left, he comes back, he knocks on the door, and that's that pitiful image of him standing in a puddle in muddy shoes, um, and it describes him as pale, right? So devoid of color, completely. So everything that makes Gatsby who he is, the pomp, the circumstance, the plumage, is taken away at this moment, right? And then fed into that machine of, the stoppage of time and it being just as uncomfortable. It's like watching paint dry. Only you're deeply embarrassed the whole time, like, oh, there's paint. What's wrong with it? Right? So Caraway can't take it anymore. He's got to walk away. Gatsby's got to go in, right, and make this okay. And here is an interesting, deeply interesting line. At one point, while he is outside staring at Gatsby's house, he says, here it is. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house. So I stared at it, like Kant at his church steeple, for half an hour. This is a throwaway line. It's so deep in meaning. Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, stated that there, there must be a God, right? That human existence is dependent on there being an afterlife, and an afterlife is dependent on there being a God, which is the fundamental basis of a lot of religion, right? When we die, there is some place to go, And so therefore there is somebody who is, managing, who has created and is in charge of that afterlife, right? What does that have to do with anything? Okay, we talked about the previous chapter, how Gatsby is being established as a god or godlike figure, right? Through his descriptions, right? His ability to evoke miracles, to create miracles when they cross the bridge, right? Caraway's seemingly undying belief in him, right? He doubted at first. He's like Thomas in the Bible. And he comes around, right? The mysterious beginnings, all of this stuff, right? Okay. But in this chapter, God would never be uncomfortable. A God would never be uncomfortable in this moment. There's no way a God screws this moment up, essentially ruins the great romance of his life, right? So Caraway is having a crisis of faith at this point. He doesn't know what to focus on. Nothing makes sense. There's no color left in the world. So he has to focus on heaven. Gatsby's house is heaven, right? And he focuses on it, and he makes this Kant reference in that, no, Gatsby has to be a god. I believe in heaven, right? I believe in that thing over there. Thus, Gatsby must exist. I believe in heaven, thus, God must exist. I believe in the afterlife, thus, God must exist. So if that is true, if there is a person over in that house, right, that represents all of these things that I want, this escape from the Midwest, the ability to accumulate wealth, to have all these nice, to be an accepted member of this world, Caraway's heaven, there must be a God behind that, and that has to be Gatsby. So at this point, right, he has his doubt, he has his crisis of faith, and he says, no, it has to be right. I have to go back. And he goes in, and everything has changed, right? Gatsby has gotten his mojo back. Something happened in that half an hour that he was outside staring at heaven, pondering, right? Thinking about heaven. Something happened. The colors restart, right? As they decide to go to the Gatsby says, I want to show you my house, right? And suddenly all of a sudden there's gold again and there's different colors, right? They get in the house and every room has a description. The colors are back. The life is back. Gatsby has his plumage back. God is back. The faith is restored, right? And then we get to one of the more interesting, and not that it isn't, this entire chapter is interesting, but the shirts. What the heck is going on with the shirts, right? They open up the closet and he's throwing out these clothes, right? There's descriptions of all these different colors. And Daisy is so overwhelmed by it, she starts to cry. Why does she cry at a bunch of colored shirts? Think of the world that Daisy now occupies, right? It's white, it's red, and it's shades of red when we think back to the description of the house, right? I keep saying right, I'm sorry. She is described wearing all white. Jordan is there. She is wearing all white. Everything in her life is pre-packaged, pre-planned, and is based on this duochromatic color scheme, essentially. There is no variety in her life. She was born rich, she had to marry rich, she had to marry an established family. There has been no life, no variety, nothing new in her life since Gatsby left. Gatsby represented the variety, the newness. He was the color in her life. And when he starts throwing out his plumage and showing her all the different experiences that he could have provided for her, it becomes overwhelming. She realizes that, you know, she made a mistake. So it should be, and it's overwhelming for her. It's overwhelming for us. It seems innocuous, but it's important. Then we finally figure out the denotative meaning of the green light, right? Gatsby explains that he bought this house specifically so he could see across the sound, and the green light is her house. And that is, when we go back to the end of chapter one, what he is stretching out his arms towards, right? That is what he wants. It's his rosebud, if you want a Citizen Kane reference, right? So we finally learn what that was. So now let's bring in the Greek mythology. Towards the end of the chapter, as Gatsby and Daisy are saying goodbye to each other, and Nick is uncomfortably on the side. He's kind of been forgotten by God a little bit, but God is, he's busy. God has things to do. God isn't listening to him at this moment. Daisy whispers in Gatsby's ear, and Caraway describes her voice as that voice was a deathless song. Now, this is interesting. Deathless. There are other ways to say that and have the same meaning. Eternal, everlasting, right? When we think of, even words that connote God. But deathless, can't be killed, can't get rid of it. That evokes some pretty interesting connotations, right? It's negative, right? She is stealing his God from him. This thing that he adores, that he idolizes, that he believes in, that he has put his faith in, has been taken away from him, at least momentarily. And so here's this voice, this deathless song. You can't get rid of it. You can't do away with it. It will never go away, right? So there's some jealousy, some bitterness in using that word. Greek mythology, sirens, right? The deathless song of the sirens. They keep singing and singing, and it lures men to their death. And we talked about it a little bit in the first chapter, how Daisy is almost always described in terms of sound. It's rare that we get like a physical description of her. It's rare that we even get any sort of emotional description of her. We get her in voice. So she is this voice. She is this Greek voice calling out, right? Luring men and people to, if you know your Greek mythology, if you've read the Odyssey, what do siren songs do? It lures men to their death. This is foreshadowing, not to give away what will happen at the end of the novel, but you should probably know that already. So, all of these things being played with in this chapter, the idea of the grand romance, Romeo and Juliet, the idea of God, the idea of Greek mythology, all come to a head in this chapter and get mixed up together. And in the end, Caraway is left there alone, walking home in the rain, as the God and the siren are together on the marble steps, marble being very important right there. He is leaving. He has been not rejected, but he has been forgotten by God, by Gatsby in this moment. And it leaves a bittersweet feeling in the reader's mind, because we want to believe in the romance. We want to believe in the Daisy Gatsby myth, right? We want to believe in the Romeo and Juliet before they go and kill themselves thing, right? We want that love. We love it so much. We want that romance. But that's what we get from them, but our narrator doesn't like it. and so has a tone and uses words that connote his disappointment, his jealousy, and even to an extent his anger, right? You go back to the beginning of this section. He's so sick of Gatsby at this point. Quit asking me to do things. Don't ask me to be your friend. He's annoyed with him before Gatsby gets his stuff together and then turns it around and becomes the god that he, has built himself up to be and that Caraway believes him to be. Only to get rejected by God at the end. He rejected God in the beginning, and then God is like, "You did that to me, here it is back to you." Although unintentionally, I don't think Gatsby means to ignore Caraway. Gatsby is so enraptured, living in this memory, living in this world that he has created for himself. And it's talked about a little bit at the end of the chapter, too, how he thinks that there were moments in the house that Gatsby may have been disappointed with Daisy, but it almost didn't matter because he had built it up so much that her flaws or who she really was didn't matter anymore. All right. So that's chapter 5. Chapter 6 next time. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.